Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with me today is Dr. Jim Tindall, Program Manager with the Department of Interior, USGS National Programs. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, you're a graduate of our master's degree program, and you're also a Native American. Today we just wanted to get your perspectives on relationships with our tribal nations and how we can be better in terms of protecting the entire country for Homeland Security.
Yeah, we're looking at tribal issues in Homeland Security, and I actually wore this jacket. It's a ceremonial jacket made by the tribe, and some of my Native American regalia to share some culture today. I guess what I'm going to say is these are my own personal viewpoints, but do not represent my agency in any way. So I have to make that clear.
Sure, and for the audience's benefit, you are Native American, and so these are your just personal perspectives.
Right. I'm actually part Cherokee and part Seminole.
Great. And can you give me a little bit about how you grew up?
I grew up on the reservation in Big Cypress, which is in Florida. It's halfway between Naples and Fort Lauderdale, off what we call affectionately Alligator Alley. And I grew up, we wrestled alligators, broke horses, fun things, unlike kids today, play computers. It was commonplace for all of us to do the same thing then.
Wow. And so that's been a long road. Now you're a PhD.
Yeah, now I have 4 college degrees, including the master's program I went through here. And it's really helped pull a lot of things together, though. Looking back at the perspective of how I grew up and really pretty much bleak poverty, which is common on most reservations today. In lots of areas.
So can you give me a perspective of, our audience are public safety officials, and they're trying to build relationships with the tribal nations. So let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that might be out there and how we can build a roadmap towards bettering our relationships.
I think one of the biggest sticking points with most tribal leaders is that the tribe wants to be recognized as a sovereign nation, which is under the trust responsibility with the federal government and various treaties and executive orders and statutes, and also under the Constitution if they're recognized as sovereign entities. A kind of a thorn and sticking point in certain respects is whenever we read about Homeland Security, we talk about federal, state, local, and tribal issues and things like that. And it appears that the tribe is equal to the state in most respects. However, the trust responsibilities seem to have slowly shifted from the federal side to the state side. And when it comes in terms of emergency preparedness, first response, Homeland Security training, things like that, the funds are actually now coming from the state. And because the reservations typically are not state land, they're not as forthcoming as wanting to share that money. But this can be an important sticking point in some regards. For example, the state of Arizona is made up 28% by Indian tribal lands. And so there's a significant portion of the state, the Tohono O'odham tribe, for example, having severe problems with illegal immigration on their 75-mile stretch of border with Mexico. And the various issues. So they're hoping if the sticking point can be overcome and the tribe become recognized as a sovereign entity, which is within the constitutional boundaries, that they will be able to communicate more directly with DHS and its partners and the federal government and not be relegated so much from state governments and so much control from the state side.
So you talked a bit about the border issues and the border tribes, which there seem to be many, and some of the critical infrastructure issues. Could you go a little more in depth about specifically on the border?
Well, on the border, probably one of the better case studies of all tribal nations is with the Tohono O'odham tribe. It makes up an area about the size of the state of Connecticut. It's just outside of Tucson, by the way. It's got a 75-mile border, actually a 3-strand barbed wire fence along with Mexico. And on average, they get about 170,000 pounds or so of marijuana each year and 140 or 50,000 pounds of harder drugs such as cocaine. The drug cartels have been actively recruiting Indian youth to try to help them smuggle drugs, and which is not much different than they've done in Mexico. And because the average family there makes about $8,000 a person, they're in extreme poverty, and it's made it difficult. A lot of the money that's spent on illegal immigration control there along the border is output by the tribe itself, with not as much help forthcoming from either the states or the federal government. And they spent over about a 3-year period $7 million or so of their own money in enforcement of illegal immigration. They only have about a 70 or 80 man police force, which has over this area the size of the state of Connecticut. When you consider shift changes and time off, you're talking about 10 or 12 officers who are in conjunction with Customs and Border Patrol officials catching this large amount of drugs. You would have to imagine what would happen if they had even better trained and more police officers along the stretch. And a sticking point for the tribe has been, I think it was around 1835 or 40, 1833, the border agreement between Mexico and the United States formed a border there. And when it did that, it actually split the tribe, so you had part of the tribe on the United States side and part on the Mexico side. And they've had fairly free migration until after the 9/11 attacks, and they strengthened border security. And a lot of the tribal members, because they have no identification of any kind, have been trying to come over and back and forth, and it's caused some fairly heated debates. And they finally, on November 3rd, they've been working on an e-card identity system with a RFID tag and other secure features in it that they will be able to issue to tribal citizens, and they will have free migration back and forth across the border, showing it as a passport. They've been opposed to putting a border fence because of that issue, and not being able to get the people back and forth to see tribal members and family and things. But with the e-card issue resolved, whenever they finally are issued the card, it will now allow the DHS to put up the 3-layer border fence along that 75-mile stretch and strengthen it pretty much like it did in San Diego, which should drastically reduce the influx of drugs and all the money that the tribe has spent. I mean, a good example of the money is not that long ago, over 140 illegal immigrants perished in the Sonora Desert, lack of water, starvation, and these issues. Because of mandated law, the tribe was forced to pay for an autopsy for each individual, which was $1,400. And when you consider all the money they spent, their own tribal members have suffered in terms of health care and education and other basic necessities, in terms of taking the money and transferring it to support the enforcement.
Well, so you've really identified a few things, and I just have to go back to the fence, the 3-strand barbed wire fence that is currently there on that particular border. That's just 3 strands of barbed wire with a stick.
You can just walk through it.
Yeah.
Typically, they will cut it and walk through, but it's minimal. Yeah. I mean, and it's caused some hard issues with Border Patrol agents who are trying to enforce the law with tribal members who claim to be a tribe, and it's like profiling. You can't prove or can't not prove, and so to err on the side of law enforcement is they're doing their job, and you can't prove your identity, so they're obligated to follow the law. And so this hasn't made them happy, but by passing the e-card now, they can put up the fence and allow. I think the plans are to have 2 or 3 checkpoints just for these residents to go through back and forth. There won't be, as far as I know now, major border crossings like in some other areas like San Diego and along the Texas border.
So then the other issue that I think is really important for our audience is that you identified the lack of training for the public safety personnel, especially the law enforcement. And so I'd be real interested in hearing your perspectives on how to improve those relationships, those training and education programs, if you had any examples of where it's worked well.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is collaboration. Tribal people want to help in the Homeland Security issue, but because of their remote locations, they don't often, especially being relegated through state funding, state Homeland Security grant programs, have the money to get the training they need, where there's first response, emergency medical services, or Homeland Security, terrorist recognition kind of issues. Yet, if you look at where they're at, they border both Canada and the United States, open water where people can come across with a boat at will. Grand Coulee Dam on the Colville Reservation is one of the largest hydroelectric power plants in the United States, or actually is the largest. And in Arizona, there's 145 dams on reservation lands. All of this critical infrastructure, refineries, sanitation systems, 10% of the energy supplies of the United States are on these lands, and they become critical issues. And if the funding can be made available, they would recognize better where to spend it, I think, than most people. Like most first response, for example, if we have a disaster, who will be there first? The local responders. Well, if, for example, the Grand Coulee Dam or some other critical infrastructure, it's on tribal lands, who's going to be able to recognize something's amiss first? It will be the tribe. Who's going to be there first to respond? It will be the tribe. But they're suffering because they have lack of funds to train and to be efficient in this area, yet they want to be a part of it. And there's so much critical infrastructure in these areas that it's I think, critical to be able to sustain the Homeland Security on a large-scale basis. And they provide gaps. If you look at the Atun tribe, if only a handful of officers are catching that amount of drugs that are coming across the border there in a short stretch, what are they not catching? And who is coming across? Tribal members and chairmen believe that, you know, transboundary issues are important, and terrorists don't respect them. Reservation themselves create a gap. And due to their remoteness, they allow them opportunities to cross and to even train and to do other necessary things that they would at will, so to say. And it's a matter of getting money, and I think making people aware that tribes really do have something to offer, and they protect both tribal lands and U.S. lands. I mean, both non-Indian and Indian alike are at risk. And so they want to fill this gap and to correct the issue. But they need the funds to train and to be better prepared. Most of them have first response groups already, firefighters, but their training would be considered on a lower basis than someone like in a large city or the federal government would hope to have. For example, suppose you had a terrorist attack on Grand Coulee Dam. I mean, as large a hydroelectric plant is, the tribe will be there first to protect it. So, but to do that well, they have to have better training, and they're going to have funds. You know, they will need those funds to do that.
And are you aware of any legislation that might enhance or enable that training?
There's been a push, and along with the Obama administration, to develop a tribal office of Homeland Security within DHS. And within this office, it would house a group where there would be widespread support, where the tribes would be represented on a fair basis. But yet, if you as a federal or state official needed information, you would have one resource to call, and they would build a stakeholder base slowly through time, working with states, local governments, cities, and all the tribal governments across the country. Could you ever please everyone? Probably not, but you would eventually get a consensus, and I think that the more it happened, the quicker a consensus on a specific issue could be gotten and the issue resolved and the stakeholders buy in, which I think would be superior to the system we have now, where there's layer after layer, like an onion, if you will. And there's a big disconnect between tribal officials at the local and state levels, and between the state and federal levels, and between the tribal leaders and the federal level itself. And so if they can create this office, I think it's the House Resolution 1697, if I believe, and it's currently in subcommittee. I think once they push it on through, that you might see some things starting to happen much more quickly, getting stakeholder issue buy-in from all the tribes, and there's so many. Over 5% of the U.S. consists of Indian lands, and tons of critical infrastructure of all kinds on these properties.
Well, it just seems that there are a lot of issues, and it looks like there are some positive movements towards building relationships, and I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for coming in.
Well, thank you very much for having me.